On an August afternoon, or perhaps, as many now believe, an October one, in the year 79 of our era, a young man of 18 stood on the terrace of a villa across the Bay of Naples and watched a strange cloud climb into the sky. His name was Pliny. He was reading, or pretending to read, when his mother pointed it out. A cloud rising over the mountains on the far shore, unlike anything either of them had ever seen. Years later, writing to the historian Tacitus, he reached for the only image that fit. It looked, he said, like an umbrella pine, one of those flat-topped Mediterranean trees. It rose on a single tall trunk and then spread at the top into branches. The trunk was white where it caught the sun. Lower down it was stained dark and blotched where it carried up by earth and ash. He did not know that he was describing the death of a city. The mountain was Vesuvius. The white trunk was a column of pulverized rock and gas, punched some 30 kilometers into the sky, and beneath it, downwind, lay the Roman town of Pompeii and its neighbors. In a little over a day, they would be gone. The young man's uncle, Pliny the Elder, commander of the Roman fleet across the bay, gave the order to launch his ships toward the cloud, to see it closely, and to save the people trapped beneath it. He never came back. This is the history of that city. Pompeii, the Roman town buried and frozen in a single afternoon, the most complete ancient city that has ever been found. But it is not really a story about a volcano as spectacle. It is about the one thing almost nobody asks about, not the eruption, the material it rained down, the ash, the stone, the burning cloud, the stuff that killed a city and then strangely kept it. Start with the material, because everything that follows is made of it. Deep beneath Vesuvius sat a reservoir of magma, molten rock, and dissolved inside it under enormous pressure a great charge of gas and water. For centuries it waited, sealed like the contents of a violently shaken bottle held shut by its cap. When the cap finally failed, the pressure dropped in an instant, and the gas came screaming out of the liquid rock. That is the whole engine of the thing. As the gas tore free and expanded, it blew the magma apart from the inside, shattering it into froth and dust before it could cool. The froth, chilled in mid-air, became pumice, volcanic glass so riddled with the holes left by escaping bubbles that it weighs almost nothing and floats on water. The Romans had a name for the little stones of it that fell out of the sky: lapilli, little stones. The finest dust of the same explosion became ash, and volcanic ash is not the soft gray powder of a hearth. It is rock and glass ground to a fine, sharp, abrasive grit, heavy in the hand, and heavier still once it drinks water. This was the material Vesuvius manufactured that day, and it made it in a quantity almost past believing. Cubic kilometers of the mountain's own insides, blasted out through the summit and carried up the column into the stratosphere, to hang there and then to fall. By one estimate, the eruption released in thermal energy something on the order of 100,000 times the force of the bomb that would one day fall on Hiroshima. But it did not arrive as a bomb. It arrived as weather. It came down first as a slow gray rain of floating stone, and it fell downwind on a town of perhaps 12,000 people who were going about an ordinary day. Pompeii lay about 10 kilometers downwind of the summit, and for the first hours of the eruption, that distance felt like safety. There was no lava. Lava is the slow cinematic danger that people imagine, and Vesuvius that day produced almost none. What came instead was the sky itself, falling. The column that Pliny had seen as a pine tree could not hold itself up forever, but while it stood, the high wind dragged its load southeast and let it drop. First came a fall of white pumice, the lapilli, pattering down like hail. Then, as the eruption chewed deeper into the mountain, a darker gray pumice, heavier and denser. And it did not stop. Hour after hour it came, until the streets filled and the stones lay knee-deep, then waist-deep, drifting against the walls like gray snow. Pumice, it's light, but it is not weightless, and it never stopped coming. It piled on the flat roofs of Pompeii until the timbers groaned and buckled, and the roofs crashed in. And in the collapsing houses, many of those who had stayed were crushed or pinned or trapped. Across the bay, Pliny wrote of a darkness that came down not like a moonless night, but like a sealed room with the lamp put out. People tied pillows over their heads with strips of cloth against the falling stones and went out into the black. For something like 18 hours the material simply rained. Those who ran early in the first afternoon mostly lived. Those who waited for it to stop, because surely it would stop, because things like this always stop, waited far too long. And yet the pumice was not the thing that would preserve the finest detail of Pompeii. That came later and faster. The rain of stone was only the burial's first blanket, laid down grain by grain until the living town was half swallowed, and still the sky had not finished with it. Sometime in the night, the eruption changed its character, and the change was fatal. The towering column began to collapse. It had been holding hundreds of millions of tons of shattered hot rock aloft on a jet of gas. When that jet faltered, the whole mass fell back down onto the mountain, and a cloud of rock and ash that falls does not gently drift. It races. Volcanologists call it a pyroclastic surge, a ground-hugging avalanche of gas and ash and stone, heated to hundreds of degrees, moving faster than a person can run, faster in places than a horse can gallop. The town of Herculaneum, on the coast directly below the volcano, had been spared the pumice. The wind had carried that the other way. It was not spared this. In the darkness, the first surges swept down the slope and over the town in seconds. On the ancient beach, archaeologists in the 1980s found the proof of it. Some 300 people crowded into stone boat chambers at the water's edge, where they had fled, hoping for rescue by sea. The surge caught them there. The heat was so extreme that they died in an instant. One study of a single victim even reported a glassy residue inside the skull, which the researchers read as brain tissue turned by that heat to glass. Then, in the gray first light of the second day, the surges reached Pompeii. They poured over the walls and down through the streets, and whoever had survived the long night of falling stone, huddled in cellars, sheltering in doorways, lying out in the fields beyond the gates, died where they were, in moments in the dark. It was the burning cloud, and not the rain of stone, that truly ended Pompeii, and it was the burning cloud, made of the very finest ash, that would remember it. Here is the strange gift buried inside the horror. Almost everything that happens to a dead city is an act of destruction. Fire consumes it, water rots it, conquerors loot it, and then the living come back and build on top, robbing the old stone for the new town, until nothing is left but foundations and confusion. That is the ordinary fate of an ancient place, worn away, picked over, quarried, and recycled into whatever came next. The ash did the opposite. It sealed, falling and then flowing over Pompeii to a depth of 4 to 6 meters and over Herculaneum to 20 and more. The volcanic material shut the towns away from air, from water, from robbers, and from time. Where nothing can rot, nothing decays, and the fine ash of the surges, settling in wet and then setting hard, took a mold of everything it touched. At Herculaneum, where the material ran hotter and deeper and set as solid as rock, it did the thing that almost no other burial can. It kept the organic world. Wooden beams and doors and beds charred coal black but whole, rope, cloth, a baby's cradle, food still on the table, and, in one great villa, an entire library. At Pompeii, shallower and a little cooler, the ash kept the surfaces of a living town, painted walls in their original color, streets rutted by cartwheels, the graffiti still legible on the plaster, and the shapes of the people themselves. What the material preserved was not a monument or a tomb built to defy the ages. It was the opposite of a monument. It was an ordinary afternoon caught whole. A town in the middle of eating lunch, closing up shop, running for the gate. The ash froze a single day in the 1st century and then held it unchanged for the better part of 2,000 years. To feel what that really means, go into a bakery. Pompeii and its neighbor had dozens of them, and in one, when the excavators reached the oven and swung its door open, they found the bread still inside. Not a picture of bread, not a hollow mold of it. The loaves themselves, carbonized coal black by the heat, and then sealed forever from decay, round, flat loaves scored across the top into 8 wedges, the very way a cook still scores them, the way you might tear a portion to hand to a friend. On some of them, the baker had pressed his stamp before baking, and the stamp can still be read. One name's a man called Sela, the slave of Quintus Granius Verus. His bread went into the oven on an ordinary morning, and it came back out 17 centuries later. This is what the material preserved, and it is why Pompeii matters in a way that no palace or pyramid can. It did not save the great or the royal or the divine. It saved the ordinary, the one thing that history almost never keeps. Jars of garum, the fermented fish sauce the Romans poured over everything, eggs and walnuts and figs left out on a table, a dog's water bowl, and scratched and charcoaled across the walls, the raw voice of the street itself. Election slogans, the price of a jug of wine, filthy insults, a couple's names cut into a rough heart, a copied out line of Virgil, and more than once the eternal human boast that some man had passed this way and had a very good time. The pyramids preserved a king's ambition. Pompeii's ash preserved a shopping list, a rude joke, and a fresh loaf of bread. It kept a whole living town in the very act of living, and it stopped the clock at the exact instant the ordinary became eternal. And it kept the color. Step into the grander houses and the walls are still painted, whole rooms of them, crowded with figures and gardens and imitation marble, and above all a deep, saturated, unforgettable red. It became so completely the signature of the ruined city that we simply call it Pompeian red, and it is a material story all of its own. The Romans painted in true fresco, raw pigment, laid into wet lime plaster, so that as the plaster dried, it locked the color into the wall as a part of the stone itself. For most colors, they used cheap earths, yellow and red ochres, chalk, charcoal, green clay. But for the richest, deepest red, the red of emperors, they reached for something rare and deadly, cinnabar. the ore of mercury, ground to a brilliant scarlet powder. Cinnabar came mainly from a single mountain in Spain, at a place the Romans called Sisapo, and the men sent to mine it, convicts and slaves, sickened and died of its invisible mercury fumes. It was so ruinously expensive that the Roman state fixed its price by law to stop merchants cutting it with cheaper stuff. Pliny the Elder, who catalogued such things, thought it half marvel and half poison. To seal it onto the wall so that it would not blacken in the light, the painters glazed it, the architect Vesuvius tells us, with wax and oil, and polished it by hand until it glowed. But there is a final twist hidden in the red, and the volcano itself wrote it. Some of the reds on Pompeii's walls, researchers now suspect, were never painted red at all. They were yellow ochre, and the searing heat and gases of the eruption washing over them as the town died chemically scorched the yellow into red. On some of those famous walls, then, two materials are speaking at once: the fabulously costly red that a rich man bought, and the accidental red that the mountain painted over him on its way past. Return now to the two men on the bay, because one of them is the reason we understand any of this at all. Pliny the Elder, the uncle, was perhaps the most curious man in the Roman world. He had written the Natural History, a vast encyclopedia that tried to contain everything the empire knew: the stars, the animals, the plants, the stones, and the very pigments on Pompeii's wall, cinnabar and ochre among them. So when the cloud rose over the bay, his instinct was not to flee from it, but to go and see. He ordered the fleet's boats out onto the water, partly to rescue the people stranded on the shore, and partly, you can feel it under his nephew's careful account, because he simply had to know what it was. He crossed the bay into the falling ash, put in at Stabii to help a terrified friend, and there the material caught up with him. Fumes and dust thickened over the beach all through the night, and at dawn, when the others rose to run, the old man could not. He died there on the sand, most likely choked by the poisoned volcanic air that he had come above all to study. His nephew, safe across the water, wrote it all down years afterward in 2 long letters to Tacitus. The cloud like a pine, the falling stones, the black midday, the panic, and the death of his uncle. They are the only detailed eyewitness account of the eruption that has survived, and they are so precise that when scientists finally came, 17 centuries later, to name this whole class of catastrophe, the tall column, the umbrella head, the rain of pumice, they named it after him. A Plinian eruption. The material took the man's life, and then it took his name, and it wears that name still. After the second day, there was nothing left to see. Where 3 towns and a scatter of rich villas had stood on a green and crowded coast, there was now only a gray plain of ash and pumice, smoothing itself over roofs and streets, and the dead alike. Even the shoreline had moved, the sea had been shoved back, and the mouth of the river had shifted, so that the survivors who returned could not always find where their own houses had once been. Some dug down through the ash after their buried silver, tunneling toward a remembered room, and then gave it up. The emperor sent aid, weighed the idea of rebuilding, and let it drop. It was easier to abandon the coast than to unbury it, and then the material did the last thing that buried things do. It was forgotten. Grass crept over the ash. Vines were planted in the rich, dark volcanic soil, which is famously, dangerously fertile. the very mineral wealth that draws people to farm and live on a killer's slopes. Farms spread across the gray plain. The towns slipped out of living memory so completely that the name of Pompeii itself came loose from the place. The low hill that hid it was eventually called vaguely Civita, the city, by people who no longer knew which city or that any city lay under their feet at all. Empires rose and fell above the seal. Rome itself collapsed. The long centuries of the Middle Ages passed over the buried streets without a rumor of them. For roughly 1,500 years, one of the most complete records of ordinary ancient life ever created lay a few meters beneath the vineyards, intact and unread, kept perfectly safe by the very disaster that had annihilated it, waiting without knowing that it waited for someone to dig. The digging, when it finally came, began as little more than a treasure hunt. In 1709, a well digger near Herculaneum struck ancient marble far underground, and a local prince set about mining the buried town for statues to decorate his palace. In 1748, the Bourbon king of Naples turned the same greedy attention onto Pompeii. For a century, men tunneled after paintings and bronzes and hauled them off to royal collections, wrecking nearly as much as they saved, treating a whole buried city as a quarry for beautiful objects. Then in 1863, a man named Giuseppe Fiorelli took charge of the excavation, and he noticed the thing that everyone before him had walked straight past. His workers kept breaking into empty spaces in the hardened ash, hollow pockets, and sometimes, at the bottom of one, a few human bones. Fiorelli understood at last what these hollows were when the fine surge ash had set solid around a human body, and the body inside had slowly rotted away to nothing over the centuries. It had left behind a perfect mold of itself in the stone, the exact shape of a living person at the very instant of death, preserved as a void in the ash. So he had liquid plaster poured carefully into the cavities, let it harden, and then chipped the surrounding ash away. What came out stopped the world, and it stops it still. Not skeletons, people. A man lying back with one hand thrown up across his face, a dog wrenching and twisting against the chain that had killed it, a mother curved protectively over her child. Two figures reaching for one another in the dark. The ash had recorded them more faithfully than any sculptor ever could, because it had taken its cast directly from the dying themselves. The material that killed Pompeii had also, in the very same motion, become the death mask of every soul it caught. Later, archaeologists refined the trick even further, pouring clear resin in place of plaster, so that the bones and a ring and a scatter of coins hang suspended forever inside the transparent shape of the person who died wearing them. For most of 2 centuries, the material was merely the thing you dug through to reach the treasure. Now, the material is the treasure, because we have learned at last to read it. Volcanologists study the buried layers at Pompeii the way others read the rings of a tree. Each band of pumice and ash records one phase of the eruption in strict order, from the bottom up. And by measuring them, scientists have reconstructed that single day almost hour by hour. When the column first rose, when the white pumice gave way to gray, when the roofs began to fail, when the burning clouds came racing down, the disaster wrote its own timeline into the ground, and we can now play it back. The ash quietly rewrote its own date, too. For centuries, the eruption was fixed to the 24th of August. taken from a much-copied line of Pliny's letter, but the excavators kept turning up autumn things, pomegranates and walnuts, braziers set out for heat, sealed jars of new wine. And then in 2018, a workman's casual charcoal scrawl was found on a wall marked with a date in the middle of October in a room that could only have been decorated a few weeks before the end. The material's own evidence had overruled the manuscript. And then there is the library. In that one great villa at Herculaneum lay some 1,800 papyrus scrolls, carbonized by the heat into fragile black lumps of charcoal, the only library to survive intact from the entire ancient world, and, for centuries, utterly unreadable, crumbling to powder at the lightest touch. Yet, in our own decade, scientists have begun to read them without ever opening them, scanning the charred rolls with powerful X-rays, and setting machine learning programs loose to hunt for the faint ghost of the ink still buried inside. The first lost words of antiquity have started to rise back out of the burnt material. Whole sentences that no living person has read in 2,000 years, coming up again out of the ash. Go back one last time to the young man on the terrace and the cloud shaped like a tree. Pliny watched a mountain kill a city in an afternoon and believed he was watching pure destruction. But he was also watching the single most complete act of preservation in the history of the ancient world. Everywhere else, Rome was, in a sense, loved to death. Its cities lived on, and so were rebuilt, robbed, remodeled, and slowly worn down, until only ruins and scattered fragments remained. Pompeii alone was struck down whole and then sealed in one day by the very thing that struck it. It is the one Roman town we can still walk through as a town, because it is the one that was murdered instead of being allowed to fade. And Vesuvius is not finished. It sleeps now above a bay where some 3 million people live, and one day the reservoir will fill, and the cap will fail again, and the mountain will make more of exactly the same material it made in the year 79. It is only a question of when. The ash is patient. It has all the time there is. The people of Pompeii wanted, like everyone who has ever lived, simply to go on living, and they were denied it in the cruelest possible way, in a few hours of falling stone and burning air. And yet the town that they lived in did not vanish the way 10,000 other towns have vanished. It was caught mid-breath. The bread still in the oven, the red still wet bright on the wall, the lovers still reaching for one another in the dark. And it was fixed there by a material slower and more faithful than any memory, any monument, any stone a king could ever raise on purpose. The volcano did not defeat Pompeii. It did something far stranger. It stopped it, and it kept it. The city died in a single afternoon. The ash remembered it forever.